So one thing to note is this is being recorded. We're going to pass the recording to Steve Tabor and David Vander Meulen for their review, and they can decide where they'd like to put it or its ultimate disposition. So if you don't want to have a recording of yourself, you should not say things or just listen in, if that makes sense. So first of all, I'm James P. Ascher, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the University of Virginia Bibliography Reading Group and the English Department's Graduate English Student Association. We've been putting our time to good use by reading major works in bibliography. One of these works is Steve Tabor's new article in Studies in Bibliography, James Shirley's Triumph of Peace, Analyzing Greg's Nightmare. And it seems an appropriate moment of peace to reflect on during our everyday nightmare. Luckily, we have both Steve Tabor and David Vander Meulen who agreed to talk about how this article came together and some of the questions it raises. Steve Tabor is curator of rare books at the Huntington Library in San Marino, but has previously been senior bibliographer at the ESTC, a cataloger, a reference librarian, and a factotum for a rare bookseller. He has written 3 book-length bibliographies on the Plantin Press, on Sylvia Plath, and on Ted Hughes. And he's written at least 19 articles on bibliography or about others' works in bibliography. He's taught at UCLA, Rare Book School, and Claremont Graduate University in courses ranging from English paleography to bibliography, but in fact 4 different kinds of bibliography that I can count: analytical bibliography, textual bibliography, descriptive bibliography, and historical bibliography. He's in fact the author of James Shirley's Triumph of Peace, Analyzing Greg's Nightmare. David Vander Meulen perhaps needs no introduction to the group of people coming here to see this little talk, but let me remind you of one number which surely comes to mind when you think of him: 275. That's the number of articles, which I counted, that David has sent through the press to be published in Studies in Bibliography so far. So I can think of 2 no better people to talk about what it is to publish and do serious work in bibliography and come up with new ideas and share them with the public. Please join me in welcoming them in a way you'd like, waving your hand or clapping or whatever.
Good to see various friends.
So we wrote up a couple questions, which I kind of circulated to Steve and David first to get the conversation going. And I might start off by asking a few of them, if that's good with you all. The first one we wrote up, which is just an introduction to kind of what we're thinking about here, is to Steve, is how did you settle on working on the Triumph of Peace? When did you do that? And what were you planning to do initially? Did you accomplish that over the 25 years you worked on it, or something else?
I was planning to lead a normal life, but no, in 1994, I was stationed at the Huntington Library, but working for ESTC, and I was recataloging their early English books with some assistance. And we had reached the letter S by 1994, and I ended up with Shirley. And what I discovered was that the 4 copies of the Huntington, 3 of them matched descriptions in printed STC. The 4th one didn't. And if I could do a screen share here, I can show you what I am talking about. This shows the coverage of the 4 STC entries for the work. And as it happens, one of the Huntington copies didn't correspond to any of them. And that's what annoyed me at the time and tipped me off that some more work needed to be done. So I started to do the work. After 20 years, I had sort of finished the work. During the meantime, it never really occurred to me that I could stop doing it. So I just followed it to the end.
That seems wonderful. I guess a follow-up one, because I want to hear in some ways about how this article came into being the way it did, is maybe David, when did you find out about Steve's work? Did you find out about it in 1994? And I wonder if you 2 discussed it as it developed, or if that was part of the process.
Well, I this afternoon looked up the correspondence about it, and In a message Steve sent me in December 2012, he said, several years ago, we talked about this, and that I had suggested that studies in bibliography would be interested, and he wondered if that was still the case, and he was now at a position he thought where he could pull these things together. So from then on, it's been developing.
It's wonderful. What was the nature, like, how was the discussion? I'm very curious. You know, so one of the questions that we talked about in the bibliography group is just the way these projects developed. And I think part of what's really remarkable about this project is the long period of time in which you worked on it, Steve. Is there a back and forth or discussion that kind of happened along the way?
If I were smart, that probably would have been the case. As it is, I recall more or less dropping it on David's doorstep in 2015 and saying, here's what I've got. And I think I could have done a lot more in the way of consulting with colleagues and so on, but it very quickly became something that I didn't...
Needle dick.
That I couldn't share because it would just be too boring and complicated for people.
Yeah, I understand that. So this 2015 is when the article arrived, is that right?
2015 was when I turned it in, right.
Okay. Can you two talk some about the process of revising for publication?
Boy.
Well, yeah.
Was it a horrible experience, as horrible as it seemed to me?
It was long, but you know, well, it's obviously a very complex article, and that's also the glory of it, I think. You know, Steve touches on, you know, virtually every aspect of the physicality of these books, and every you know, all the major methods of bibliographical analysis, and that come into play to, you know, form one, well, sort of symphony. It's interesting that studies in bibliography seem to be a good venue for this. First of all, it's I think an exemplary work of bibliographical analysis. So I think it is a classic. Then the question is, where do you publish a classic? And one nice thing about the format of Studies in Bibliography coming out as a hardcover volume is that we can have both, well, the size of an article is less significant. Prospective authors often ask about the length of an article, and the answer tends to be as long enough to make your point clearly, and then no more. So whatever that might mean. And in particular instances, this year we had well, Steve's article, of course, also another very long one by Tom Tansel, but also a very short one by a UVA grad student, Sam Limley. I think it was about 4 pages or so. And that's the you know, the joy with a large volume like that. You can have papers of different lengths. So so that was good. And also, you know, this kind of article, it was sort of the link between an article and a book or monograph. But then, you know, you try to think of what publishers would publish this as an independent monograph. And well, if some publishers, university press publishers are down to 150 print copies of a book these days, you know, who's the market for something like this? And so that's another function we see a journal such as Studies performing, that we can print these longer articles. And also Fritz and Bowers tended to see studies as a reference source, and which means that some of it will be immediately applicable available to those who are hungrily waiting. Others won't discover it won't have a need for it for years, but it'll be available in a recognizable source. And interestingly, in the reading room of the British Library, there are, they don't have any journals on the shelves, but Studies in Bibliography is one of them, which I think recognizes this nature of the journal also, that it serves as a reference source and therefore is not necessarily trying to capture the critical winds of the moment or what's popular at the moment, but not to overly glorify for all time, but nonetheless that it has a lasting sort of foundational value. So so at any rate, it was all very attractive, and Steve is widely known as one who does good work and careful work, and so yeah, what's to lose? Let's go.
But James, you're asking about the collaborative aspect of this, and what David did a lot of was simplify things, simplify the presentation of the tables, and improve the navigation so that it really follows more logically than it did in the version I submitted.
Yeah, that's interesting. In terms of generalizations about the editorial process, for one thing, there has to be trust between the editor and the contributor, and have to make sure both groups understand that we're all aiming for the same thing, to make this presentation as effective as possible. So sometimes that trust is there from the start. Sometimes had instances where it never quite develops. So some authors never quite trust the editorial people. But the other thing is that, and what Steve points to, is that when someone works on any project for a very long time, certain things become second nature to that author. But in fact, they're not second nature or even first nature to the other readers. And that's why, just for everything we do, a fresh pair of eyes is good. It really extends to every phase of the publishing or the creative writing process of thinking about things to start with and writing it out, and then even at the end proofreading just to make sure that that fresh pair of eyes hasn't, or you might see something that the originating eyes have not. So so those are some of the dynamics that go into things then.
I like that, and I want to make sure that the people here know that they can jump in with questions too. I have kind of like a bottomless list that I can keep doing, but I don't want to.
Yeah, I did have a question actually in response to the idea of simplifying the article. Obviously, any kind of editing involves simplifying and clarifying, but in terms of the bibliography, a lot of our group, we discuss a lot of the kind of main questions about bibliography and differences between book history and bibliography and the kind of audience you're trying to reach. And so I wonder if any of those simplifications touched the actual bibliographical analysis, or if it was mostly just trying to figure out how to phrase that analysis in clear prose.
I think the concepts in the article are kind of irreducible. What David did was kind of improve the hierarchy of the sections and what was contingent on what else. There's that I see the article as kind of a sandwich where the bread, the first part and the last part are the tasty parts, and the middle is kind of hard to digest. And we just did whatever we could to make it as digestible as possible.
Yeah, what I find myself doing quite often with studies is something akin to that. When you have a long article, you want to know where the divisions of thought are in it. And so we often introduce Roman numerals for sections of it, at least to make those as markers, because the goal, after all, is communication. And if if it doesn't communicate, and if it can't communicate, then it's sort of pointless. There's no, there is an audience in sight. As for Lucie, your question about audiences in particular, I don't think I try to think about that too often. Just are these good ideas that make sense? And now, on the one hand, we are, broadly aware of what's relevant to this particular journal or not. But but from the very start, back in the 1940s, it's had a broad audience in mind, and some people will be interested in something, some in others, but really I'd say we don't think in terms of taxonomies of what kind of reader is this in terms of the field of books. I see bibliography as book history, and the kind of article Steve has written now pursues some aspects of the wide world of books. Other articles would pursue others, and so Steve's, for instance, he talks at the beginning about the circumstances from which this mask arose, but he doesn't. The focus of the article is not to try to identify the 20,000 people or so who bought the pamphlet. On the one hand, that's fascinating, and he touches on that, but the goal here is something else, and he keeps that clearly in mind as he works through the whole business, not being diverted by these fascinating questions. Although, again, he acknowledges them, which is I think a good way of handling it, saying, "Oh, this is going on, and of course you're wondering about this, and here's what I think might be the case, but here's really what I want to do."
This fits nicely with, because I think one of the first things we did as the bibliography reading group in tackling this was to actually enumerate the divisions. And it's a wonderfully divided article with lots of interesting sections. There's clearly a lot of fruit that comes out of it. But there's one part that I was particularly interested in, and I gave you both fair warning about it. It's, for those of you who have a copy of it nearby, it's the bit where, I lost my own page reference. The bit where you engage in a bit of counting, and you're trying to count the number of copies. And for me, it has this real kind of energy behind it, where you spend a page looking as though you're going to resolve. You're like, okay, so if we count it this way, we can calculate this number, and then this number, and then it's this, but we don't know that. And it goes on and on and on. And eventually you say, well, we don't know for sure, but here's a guess. And I guess part of my question for you, Steve, on that part, if you'd like to talk about it, is like the way that read to me is someone actually exploring the idea and struggling with and trying to come to account and being cautious with their data. But I wonder if that's an effect of the writing, or that's an effect of how you thought through it. Does that make sense as a question? I can find the page for you if you'd like.
No, I know the section very well. It's a question that everybody has to tussle with at some point who's dealing with the printing history. And it's a question that I'm asked very often in a curatorial capacity. People want to know, how many copies of this old book were printed. And to keep giving the same answer that we don't know, but it was generally between these two very widely separated figures, and here's why. Pardon me, here's why that was. Doesn't seem to me satisfactory, and I keep bashing my head against the issue. And I actually have a small collection of print runs, that have been established and published, just so that I can keep one foot in reality. But, greater minds than I have tried the same thing. Paul Needham published an article a few years ago in collaboration with a mathematician where they tried to extrapolate incunabula print runs from the surviving copies. Much more sophisticated than what I did.
That makes sense. I mean, you can see a little bit of that. I think your the combinatorial counting. This is on page 186, 187, for those of you who have your copies of studies to look at. Seems related to that. Can you talk more, like what was it simply a desire to kind of answer that basic question, how many copies were printed, that kind of put you down this pathway initially? Or was why you decided to write this bit? I guess that's what I'm trying to ask.
First of all, it was important in order to try to estimate the time of printing, the time it took to print. It gave me something to plug into the table, even if it was kind of arbitrary. I also thought it was important to answer the question of the relative sizes of the 4 phases, which I think was more successful than maybe estimating the absolute numbers. But it was something that I felt I couldn't ignore, and it played into another part of the article.
Yeah, I might say that, well, I admire this section, even in its gentle uncertainty, and part of, because of that, I mean, it's, as Steve just said, it's a question people constantly are asking, but also I think it's a model of, well, the phrases that some of you from classes have heard, distinguishing the possible, the probable, and the demonstrable, and then making clear what your level of evidence is for what you're suggesting here. I mean, it's certainly fascinating, desirable to have someone who spent decades on this offering, his thoughts about, what do you make of this? So hate to not have that at all, but then, Steve recognizes, the relative levels of certainty of each of these factors, and then takes those into account for his explanation.
I think Michael's got his hand raised. I don't know if that's on purpose.
Sorry. Yeah, I did have a question. I guess sort of, I'm happy to hear that Dr. Tabor has a sample of actual data on print runs. As somebody who often approaches these issues from the opposite perspective, as somebody who has, I'm working with the Longman Archives, lots of information on the sort of accounting and bookkeeping level about the print runs, but not a lot of access to physical copies. Whether one, if you had like a dream of the kind of information that you would want, what would sort of be your dream data be? And 2, does this project tell you things about what sort of details you should look out for in the physical record where it does exist, in, the Boyer Ledgers or Cambridge University Press? Does it reorient any of that material?
I think if you've got the Boyer Ledgers, you can look at the book ever so long and it won't tell you anything more. I mean, Boyer Ledgers is great to have. So, I'll bow to the archival evidence on that count anytime.
Yeah, but I suppose on the other hand, maybe it's like you wouldn't know about an italic raid just looking at the Boyer Ledgers, but maybe you, maybe there's something where there's a conversation that can happen between the analytical bibliography and the collateral evidence, as Bowers would call it.
The print number is not, not a big part of the question. If you're talking about how the thing came into being, then you're not talking about numbers until you need to talk about the numbers. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, thank you.
I know another thing, we're trying to get you to share any images you prepared, Steve, if you'd like. I think we have the graffiti artist is no longer with us. I'm very interested in, and we talked a lot about how you analyze the flipping, right, for perfecting sheets, and then the kind of like packaging up, which I know is the bibliography group. We spent a long time talking about how this is kind of like a perennial question. People are like, oh, did they do it in a regular way? Was it totally wild and unpredictable? Was it sort of predictable? Was it, and this fits into the whole question of printers of the mind and all sorts of rich bibliographical things. I wonder if you would talk some about your thinking on that as a way of getting into any charts you want to share with the group, or a way of thinking about how the book was produced. Or actually, if you just want to think about what it is to weigh in on that.
Well, I would say that the flipping discussion is one of the weaker parts of the article, in my opinion. And it comes out of the compulsion when looking at these tables that I put together, you know, the tables of variance, and they don't sort in the right way, and you can't give a definite sequence to things. You feel obligated to come up with some sort of excuse for how that came about. And at one point I say, well, you know, unless the guy, you know, dropped a handful on the floor and picked them up at random, there's really no other way to explain this. It may be that I went too far in trying to explain every last thing, but after 18 years, you don't want to let it go.
I don't know if I speak for the rest of our group, but we actually, I found it at least, a strong part of the article, because it smacks of the truths we always find, which is like, it's kind of regular sometimes, and other times it's wholly unregular. And that seems to be often the discovery, which is like, well, sometimes you can predict things with it and sometimes you can't. And once you get to that, it seems as though you've understood a phenomena.
You understand the extent to which you can explain the phenomenon. Yeah. You map the limits of your knowledge.
Yeah. I don't know. I was curious if you want to go back and talk about the tables some, because I know one thing that we were very interested in, or I know I'm interested in, is the way in which the tables were restructured for publication. I know you've shown me sometime in the past your working tables, which I don't know if you have around, and I know you have the color tables, and I know that, you know, I was struck, and you were both warned I'd bring this up with David, some similarities with your article on the printing of Pope's Dunciad of 1728, this kind of tabular examination. So I don't know if you guys can get into a little bit about how those tables ended up working out.
The tables were absolutely essential to avoid English prose explanations, which would be so rebarbative that nobody would read the article. I like to make things as visual as I can, as often as I can, because people can immediately grasp complicated things, or, you know, maybe not so immediately. So that I could not have done without the tables. And what David did was he said, okay, I had borders in all of the cells. I had drawn borders, and he said, you don't need those, take them out where you don't need them. And it lightened up the page quite a bit, and didn't make it any harder to read.
Did you bring the, this paper in 2015 arrive with the color version of the tables or the grayscale version of the tables?
It arrived with the color version, and my grand plan for this was there was going to be an envelope at the back of the issue with a folded color chart, maybe two-sided, and you could, you know, unfold it like a map and really see what was going on. And David fairly quickly disabused me of that and said, we're going to have to find some other way to do it.
Well, I recall I had a fold-out chart once in an issue of PBSA, and a good part of the run of PBSA was digitized early on before the current form, and lo and behold, they skipped that chart. They didn't know how to do it. It was the crucial chart for the explanation of everything. And so that was just trying to reconstruct the last couple of years. That I'm sure was one of the factors in my mind, realizing that if it's not there, it doesn't do anybody any good if they're trying to read it. Yeah, another problem, you know, it is a problem of the, or challenge of the print form to, you have to attach it. I mean, we could have attached it in some way, a full-out chart, but all of that gets very complicated and very expensive. And some of the binding has to be done almost by hand then. And that, the problems seem insurmountable after a while. And we are fortunate in having, our Bibliography Society, a website where, with the assistance of the technicians in the library, where we can put things online as well. And we've done that with a number of articles, for instance, on the Art Deco book, or on watermarks in 16th century Piers Plowman and what have you. And those are wonderful supplements to the article then. What you have to do is make sure that they're fitting with each other. So in Steve's article, we refer to the color chart that is online, and likewise in the online version under the digital publications, we the headnote refers back to the to the published form too, so that they're in sync with each other. A couple other thoughts. James, I had never thought about this article in conjunction with my article in the Dunciad, and or not made the direct link, and perhaps it's because I simply, like Steve, admire charts anyway, and there was just a sort of a natural way of thinking. I once sat in on a colleague's class on scientific writing, and it was interesting. The main point that I recall vividly is that writers in the humanities seemed locked into prose unnecessarily. And sometimes an illustration, a chart can do so much more so quickly that one ought to abandon or push pause of the prose and just lay it out there. And so so Steve's chart seemed a natural way of natural method that they weren't a question for me at all.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, I guess on the visualization line, what does the digital version of the chart achieve that the print version doesn't? I mean, David, you spoke about the important preservational and access parts of making a chart that fits within the convention of the book, both so it's not removed by some later rebinder, but also so that it can be digitized in a sensible way in some, not yet anticipated process. But I'm curious what the digital chart does that the book doesn't do.
Steve?
If I may just share this, this is the chart that we're talking about. Wait, no, I'm sorry. Let me see if I can. I've got too many things open here and it doesn't seem to be present. Doesn't matter. The color lets you take in immediately what copies belong to which group. And it shows you the unevenness of the distribution in the number of printings, I'm sorry, the number of copies of every quire that survive, and gives you a feeling for the unevenness of the production process, which the grayscale doesn't really succeed in doing as well, in my opinion.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. I like that. It's kind of an expressive value in some ways, because you could, I suppose, with a paint by numbers set, recreate the color chart from the grayscale chart, but it wouldn't be the same. Along those same lines, I guess one of the things I also wonder about is the copies you looked at, right? So you've looked at many, if not a majority, I think. I tried to look at the STC, but I quickly got confused by the multiple.
Oh, yeah, STC is a subset. I saw about 55 copies and I know of a couple more.
Okay. I'm curious what you think about
Thank you.
that. Oh, David's got it.
There's the chart or part of it. Yeah, there we go. Don't know how the size is on your screens, but
It's
I've
good.
also just sent a URL to the Studies in Bibliography page if you want to look at it there too.
thank you, thank you.
That gives an
So,
idea anyway.
Yeah. So there, yeah, there it is, and all the idiosyncrasies of the individual copies, and but yet they, viewed en masse, they fall into groups, or they can be sorted into obvious groups. So yeah.
I was trying to do everything in one chart here, and that may be too much to have attempted.
It's something I have a great deal of sympathy for. There's a talk I imagine you giving, which is just one slide, this chart, and you explain every fact of it, which I think, I don't know, it's not my place to suggest that talk, but that would be a fascinating talk to see.
Well,
But
in effect, the article is that talk.
Yes.
well, that's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of it's something about it's like a map of the new world in some ways, where there's a lot of information embedded in it. I'm curious, Steve and David too, actually, if you can talk about. I started to ask about the number of copies. I kind of was trying to do quick and rough and ready analysis and trying to imagine this study done only with the copies at the British Library, at the Folger, and at the Huntington, and what you would have missed and what you gain by more copies, because some of them are unique and some are different, and what your guess or sense would be what you would gain with looking at even more copies.
I think with only those copies, that'd be about 12 or so, as I recall.
Yeah.
You could grasp the basic outline of what was going on. You would miss a lot of variants and a lot of new mysteries, and some things that really kind of extend the general understanding of how the thing was done. So it would not be a pleasant prospect. I mean, there's unique copies at the Bodleian and at St. Catherine's, Cambridge, and I made the statement near the end that even unto the 50th copy, there were new things coming out. You don't want to let that go.
Yeah. I'm wondering, right? Because there's always this problem of survival and evidence, and, the 61st and the 70th copy surely has more too. Like, I wonder about what this article tells us about how to take articles that look at 12 copies versus articles that look at 50 copies versus articles that look at 100 copies. I know I'm asking you to speculate, which is maybe not something you're willing to do.
12 copies may be enough given the problem at hand. It may be as much as you want to know or want to say at this point. With the STC, there are a lot of little bombs hidden in the records there that somebody's going to dig up, but for the time being, it's good enough.
Okay.
So I have a question. Steve, did you work with photographs and reproductions of everything to do your primary work? And do you think anything was lost in that, or did you get to see originals of most everything? Question one. And question two is, did you do any machine collation, or was this all your eyelashes on the sidewalk?
No, very good question. I think about a quarter or a third of the books I didn't see in person. I saw digital copies. When I went on a research trip, I traveled with a fistful of photocopies, starting with the Huntington copies and accumulating more as I went. This was before, digital cameras and stuff like that, so I was really using photocopy. I never did machine collation, partly because it's almost impossible to get real copies together with the machine. And what I did get out of that was the ability to evaluate the artifacts you find in photocopies and to separate them from what was actually in the book. And that's been a very valuable bit of knowledge.
Can you describe that knowledge? That actually seems like, I want to read that article.
Well, you see a dot on your photocopy. Is that in the book, or is that on the, is that from the toner? Sometimes you can tell by the shape of the dot. Sometimes you can say, okay, is this letter actually damaged, or is it, is there a digital dropout, or, it's an artifact of some way. You can look at the same spot in other copies, other photocopies, and very often you can see that what is missing is a mechanical issue with the photocopier and not with the book itself. You look at enough copies in that one spot, and you can start to sort out the artifacts from the real thing.
Did you develop an aesthetic sense of the artifacts? Like, could you guess based on what something looked like, whether it was a photocopy artifact or a paper flaw or printed, or?
I think I developed an ability to do some of that. Of course, it's never something you want to trust implicitly. And sometimes I would write and say, do you have this blat on this page, but yeah.
What is your, and along the same lines, I mean, one of the things that I love about the article is the appendix, where you've not only given the classifications of the variants, but you've given a very convenient shorthand to check a particular copy, right? So you can check each you don't have to look at every point you've noticed in your notes. You can look at these few points and kind of classify things. And this might be for both of you. What's your hope? What do you hope people will do with that? I have some ideas, but I'm curious what you hope for that section.
Well, I intended it to be a tool so that if a new copy comes up, you can classify it, and you can also see if it's breaking the pattern, if there's something new. My bachelor's degree was in zoology, and this was a form that was familiar to me from keying out caddisfly larvae, in fact. So I thought it was readily adaptable to the problem here.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, that fits with, I imagine that same thing. I imagine coming across this as a cataloger and saying, oh, well, let's see how this fits. And when it doesn't fit, you write and you say, oh, Steve Tabor, I found this thing that doesn't fit. Am I using it wrong? Is this a new one? And suddenly you're off to see a new, unique copy. It seems like a particularly generous part of the article. And I don't know, it seems to me characteristic of some articles and studies in generally, that they often present you with sufficient information to add to them or modify or disagree or relate to them. I wonder if that's by design. I guess I'm kind of addressing that to David, but curious if Steve has thoughts on that as well.
Oh, yeah, you're gracious in attributing good things to design. I was thinking, I mean, on the one hand, I think any alert mind reading any of these articles, well, I would hope would have thoughts triggered about other parallel instances and analogous situations, or what else this might mean. I think that's one of the benefits of the first appendix here, where Steve goes through it page by page and points out the significant variants. Even if no one is interested in the triumph of peace per se, I think these are, it's a wonderful guide about what kind of factors one might identify to distinguish different copies. And whether it's a spacing or a punctuation or number of acorns or what have you. Oh yeah, I wonder if that'll apply to something I'm looking at. And so I think that appendix can be useful in its own right I mean, obviously useful for the triumph of peace, but again, with an imaginative mind approaching it, I think that great benefits can come from something that seems as specifically pointed as this is to a particular play.
It was actually a corporate effort. I would send this out to librarians and say, would you please key out your copy? It should take you about 15 minutes. And the sort of responses I got, the types of indeterminacies and puzzlement and so on, really enabled me to hone it to as fine a point as I could. And it's as short as it can be with the information we've got.
Do you have, I'd be fascinated to see an earlier form of the key, or maybe you can describe it. Because that's another thing that I didn't realize this article was, it's another article would be wonderful to read, is like how to successfully communicate via email with a librarian who's only vaguely known to you, who's very busy, but who would love to help. That's rather useful. Maybe you can talk about some of what you remember not working well and ways you learned to adapt it, Steve.
It's a matter of phraseology, of being clear in what you want. And I can't think of a particular example, but I do know that I made numerous revisions based on things that other people couldn't figure out from what I'd written.
Have you heard from anyone with new variants since this article came out? I mean, I guess it came out just months ago.
No. Luckily, I have not. I don't think enough people have read the article to turn anything new up.
It's only a matter of time, I assume.
Yeah, Steve,
I hope so.
Yeah, you get questioned yourself as a librarian, parallel to what you were asking others. And how much time are you able to spend on answering queries?
If I were the recipient of this sort of thing?
Yeah.
If they said it would take 15 minutes, I would gladly do it. If they just dropped it on me and said, "Could you do this?" I would gulp. But this is my thing, and this is something I like doing for people.
I'll ask a technical question, which I'm very curious about, but it's in the weeds, and everyone in the bibliography group knows. But I'm very interested in like the migrating pieces of type, which is a phenomenon I think anyone who spent time mechanically collating books or just looking at multiple copies has seen. And to me, you know, I read your bafflement at it, where you're like, well, I guess it must not be locked up enough, but then how would they move the form around, because it'd be too loose? So there must be like a middle region where it can move. I've also heard it suggested that maybe the type is bending. And so what appears to be shifting around is like, you know, an unsupported numeral that's like slowly going this way or that way. I'm not convinced that I know what they are, but I wonder if you could talk some, Steve, about your thinking about lockup versus bending versus what else might be going on with these strange migrating page numbers.
Yeah, if I had the time to do another big project, I'd work on this issue, which is what's really going on the press bed, and how are they printing with a form that is obviously wobbly? How do they get it to the press? How does it get wobbly? Where does it get wobbly? Peter Blaney, while my article was being edited, Peter Blaney came out with an article called Quadrat Demonstrandum about quotation quads. And I realized that this was the answer to my puzzlement about one of the pages where the bottom line tilts upward or bends upward. It's filled with quotation quads. And we are able to insert a footnote with, I think it was 12A or something like that, at the last minute. Last night I was reading the article over again and realized I hadn't tied it up in a different part of the article. So that's a little last minute thing. But I've got many photographs of places where things are slipping off the page. And Blaney himself even has a great example where a pie-shaped wedge is being extruded from the top of a page, and eventually the top line bit goes away and everything else is offset by one line. I mean, it's just extraordinary geology.
Have you seen, because I know you print, I know at least in some of your courses you actually have people print locked up forms. Have you seen this occur empirically, like as a phenomena, like type slowly being worn down like a canyon?
In my printing unit of my rare book school class, we've always got the help of an expert at the press, and they don't permit things like that to happen. They always lock it up tight. But obviously, back in the day, people were not doing this, and they were getting away with it, usually. That's the mystery.
Yeah. Interesting. I don't know if anyone else is equally interested in moving types, but I think they're riveting.
Yeah, I want to jump in here. James, we had a really interesting conversation in our last bibliography reading group meeting about skeleton forms and furniture and whether or not, and I think James was kind of moving towards this with your last question, but whether or not you could kind of, like if one were to methodically pay attention to changes in the furniture of the form, could you trace patterns and then kind of apply that? Could that be a kind of building block, right? A reference that you could then apply to multiple works? Could you kind of figure out a pattern based just on the furniture? James might be able to summarize that better than I can.
We're having a debate because Moxon talks about pulling the furniture out and putting it to the side and then using the same furniture. So we were discussing whether or not the non-printing furniture was part of the skeleton form or not, since if you had similar pages, you would just move it over, assuming you're not interrupted in some way. And that made us start wondering if you measured things like inner margins, if you might detect the substitution of furniture versus retaining the same furniture and how flexible that is. And I think, Lucie, your suggestion is even that like there might be wobbly furniture, that if one were able to detect the replacement and the same furniture, you could be like, well, this thing, which happens to be this wide, who knows what it is real wobbly?
In our debate, if you will, discussion, I have less faith in compositors, I think, than James does. And James was kind of assuming that this might be a very methodical thing where you put like X piece of furniture to the side and then reinsert exactly X piece of furniture where that was. And I was like, I think they're tradesmen who are kind of hammering these furniture pieces in to lock up the chase there. And so I was kind of wondering what, like maybe where you stand on that kind of debate between very accurate use of furniture and perhaps you just use whatever piece is on hand.
If you get on the press and you try making substitutions, they won't fit. And I think this is a case where a little bit of care saves a great deal of trouble down the line if you really do put them back where they came from.
So it sounds like I got that one. I'm on the right side, Lucie. I win that debate, at least according to Steve.
Yeah, I think the larger question, I guess, is, how much do you ascribe intentionality or error to certain quirks that you see in the printing of several copies of text like this? You're observing these differences, but how are these differences meaningful and to what extent are they meaningful? I guess that's like my philosophical and less technical question, but it has technical implications. Well,
meaningful bibliographically or meaningful textually?
Well, meaningful, I would say historically, you're trying to reconstruct the process, yes, but you are ascribing either intentionality or just randomness to that process that you then reconstruct. So I'm just wondering, do you try to account for every single change in the same way or give it equal attention, or do you make a kind of prioritization based on which of these is going to tell me about the history of the print shop and which of these just seem to be, well, you can't explain it, it's just there, like a straight piece of type?
it's a worthy study to figure out what these people noticed and what mattered to them and what they corrected. And I've seen a great deal of variability in pickiness, you know, when it comes to detail, but also a great variation in what kind of detail people focused on. And it's really an individual thing.
I want to note where, oh, Benjamin has something.
Oh, is that okay?
Yeah, you should.
To pick up a bit on Shelmy's question, I'm so struck by the actual narrative that kind of bookends your piece of William Prynne making a kind of key mistake with histriomastics that the Inns of Court then have to pick up the tab for, to the tune of $4 million or 20,000 pounds. And I'm just struck by the idea that kind of all of this this kind of messy furniture in multiple versions and lists of errors attend to what's basically a kind of a politics and a mistake by Prynne and a kind of like the kind of the royal focus. Yeah, so I'm wondering if you might speak to why this matters in the sense of the politics of this age.
Now that you've got my weak point here, I'm not a historian. I would observe, though, that the part of the Prynne book that really gave offense was an index entry, and I would wonder whether Prynne himself wrote the index or someone else did. The index entry read, "Women actors notorious whores," and this was taken to refer to the Queen. But did Prynne write that? So I'm really punting on this. I don't know how to relate it immediately to the bibliographical issue.
But yeah, I mean, that's amazing. It's very exciting that this much fuss, this much kind of chaos in the printing house could attend on what was basically a misinterpretation even of Prynne. Yeah.
Well, it points also to the tremendous political and religious tension of the time when, you know, just like a tiddlywink, any little movement could make things fly in the air.
I mean, I was struck, I like your question. It felt, in reading this, because you framed it that way, it felt like this was punishment in some ways for the printers and the people who had to pay to do this thing several times, 3, maybe 4 times, depending on how you count, that it was like this kind of excessive act, that it was prepare and print this thing in these large numbers, and that I mean, I think what Benjamin's getting at is like wondering if the sloppiness in some way links to that, the idea of like printing as punishment. I don't know if that's too far. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
Oh yeah, that's great.
I think that is too far because I don't think there was any animus against the printer. I think the printer was just caught in a sudden demand for the text, and the publisher had to you know, do what he could to cover it. So as usual, the lower class guy gets gets it in the neck, and but they paid well for it.
Wonderful.
Sorry, James, I win that one.
You do. What I wanted to note, and Benjamin, you did exactly what I was going to note, is that we've been doing this an hour, and I know some people are shyer and quieter, so I just wanted to like let the end trickle out. If you have a question that you've really been wanting to ask and you feel quiet about it, we're all just going to be quiet for a bit and give you a chance to speak up. It's a pretty rare opportunity, I think, to have this combination of people.
Thank you, James. I thank you both for being here. I appreciate it very much. I wanted to ask, so I've taken Professor Vander Meulen's course in bibliography a year ago, so I'm a little bit rusty, but still really got into it the analysis here. It seems like you're both interested in maybe refocusing bibliographers' attention on different aspects of books in a way. In Dr. Tabor's work, you mentioned moving the main part of the text to the center as opposed to just looking at title pages. And I know Professor Vander Meulen has worked on looking at paper without watermarks as a new, this was a while ago, but sort of as an angle that people hadn't considered. So I don't know what the question is, but I just noticed that maybe similarity between your work and whether you could speak to that, or whether you want bibliography to focus on these previously ignored aspects of books. Moving on.
I didn't, I think I never had an agenda on this, and if specific points of focus emerged, it was because I had to pay attention to them or to realize them in order to get to the end. So once I let go of the title page, I found that things became much easier.
That makes sense. That's really interesting. Yeah.
When did you let go of the title page? Sorry, I need to piggyback on that.
I could show you some early attempts to tie everything together, and they look like, wiring diagrams for computers. They're not at all pretty, and it was a total dead end. And I started taking things apart one by one. And once I understood them, then I was able to reassemble them, and the title page is sort of hanging out on the side.
Yeah, I find it just utterly fascinating to, I think often I think of it as archaeological work, but trying to reconstruct the past, what was going on. I mean, to think that we can figure out what was going on in an industrial workplace 400 years ago by analyzing the materials, that's just utterly fascinating to me. And I don't know what I'm going to find, and it's not an agenda so much as just a fascination with certain aspects of approach, and it doesn't rule out other approaches by any means, but it's one that simply has not been, I mean, just by its history, has not been developed very far. And we have, I checked this one time, and maybe some of you can actually tell me where I wrote it, but I think that, there are maybe a couple dozen pieces of shoes that were made in colonial Williamsburg. There's just different parts of the shoe, not even whole shoes. And yet we have thousands of items printed in colonial Williamsburg. And so we can find, the same interest that propels explorers of either material, we have so much more to work with, and if we know what questions to ask. And partly learning what questions to ask arises from jumping into something and butting your head against the wall. It's not the title page, not, what am I going to do then? And when I worked on the Dunciad, I was preparing a bibliographical description of these over several decades, and so I thought I would proceed chronologically according to the editions. And the very first one was the biggest problem of all, and it took forever, but it forced me to devise some new ways of looking at things. And I have pages and pages and pages of notes that I will never use, little measurements and so on. I didn't know what it was, but each of these has a story in some way or other, and is partly why I think this kind of bibliographical investigation is clearly a form of creative writing. I mean, I think all scholarship is, but it depends on the imagination and creativity that the practitioner brings to it. Which is like anything else then. Here the stuff is, what are you going to do with it? And you can see it as inert facts, or you could let your mind work over it and make something out of it. So I think it's great fun, and the applications vary. Sometimes there's no immediate implication or application, but the other hand, all this is cumulative too. And I mean, here, the triumph of peace. Okay, in all deference to the what's accomplished here, not that many people care about Shirley's triumph of peace. But this is just, I think, an amazing article for showing ways of looking at an object or a set of objects and seeing what can be done when an observer one looks closely at them.
It's the uses of frustration.
Yeah.
Isn't there fun in there too?
There was a lot of fun, but it was many years of Saturdays.
Wonderful.
Just to kind of piggyback off of Professor Vander Meulen's remark there on the kind of application of this type of article, I just wanted to comment on the fact that I really enjoyed the last part, the very end of the article, where you kind of took a step back and talked about the broader application of some of these kinds of analytical bibliographical practices, if you will. And so I wonder if that was part of the, what'd you say, 2015 copy that was dropped off, or if that was a kind of collaborative, let's take a look at how this can be applied. If it is indeed a reference article, let's give people a little reward for, for finishing the article and see how they can apply it to other kinds of bibliographical projects.
I was kind of scrambling for something something plenary to say at the end, and that's what came out. That, it may not be a big iceberg, but here's something to look for. I think the main thing was just to have been able to catalog the 4 Huntington copies of Triumph of Peace, and I achieved that.
This is the most intense cataloging experience ever, perhaps. Andy, I think you had a follow-up that you started.
Just wanted to thank you both for your responses. It just seems like you start out with the question, how was this book put together? And then you maybe start with a certain aspect that varies, like the title page, and then you realize that doesn't give you enough information. So it's just interesting to see how your process was shaped as you went through it and maybe saw different forms of evidence answering or redirecting or reshaping your question as you went through it. That's helpful in some ways.
The job was to assemble all of the variants in order to account for this one dropout copy that STC didn't take account of, or it broke the paradigm that STC had set. And so it's something of David's method, as I gather, of just measuring everything and looking at everything and just tabulating everything, and maybe throwing out some things at the end that aren't relevant. But I was just trying to find a regularity to it and find how one thing evolved from another and how it came to be, and it just got out of control.
Or came under control eventually.
Well, yes. I'm not sure it still is.
Thank you.
Well, I think we've gone for an hour and 20 minutes, I imagine, or 10 minutes. I imagine people have things to do.
Like eat.
Yeah, that's right. What time is it in California?
Oh, it's only 4 o'clock or so. No, 5 o'clock.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, we can go for another hour then, right?
I'm having dessert.
Must all be hungry.
No, before we part, I want to thank everyone for being involved. I found this fascinating, and I enjoyed your questions, and so much enjoyed hearing Steve's further thoughts about this. And also good to see people who haven't been in touch with for a while. Douglas, so glad you could join us, and Ben, and Nora, and then David, who's had to leave now. So and all the rest of you too. So you all.
Thank you for getting this together. It's really been fun.
Thank you for spending the last hour and 10 minutes with us. We really appreciate it. And great discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Hey,
Keep up the good work.
Stay safe, everyone.
okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.